Hello everybody and welcome to another exciting episode of General Biology 1. Today we're going to have a short little discussion talking about species and where they come from, or the process of speciation. So here I have some pictures of some animals. Here you have 4 species of turtles. You can see their top shell known as the carapace and the bottom part of the shell known as the plastron. And they're all slightly different. You can also see their heads right there. They're all basically the same type of turtle. They're a slider turtle belonging to the family Emididae, which is basically the family of pond turtles, the types you see sitting on top of a log in your local pond. And they're an example of sliders, and each of these sliders is found in a different river system in North America. They're kind of similar. They're kind of different. Some are more different than others. But when you take them together and you house them in the same place, they often interbreed and produce offspring. And then on the other side here, we have 2 sets of birds that look very, very, very similar. And the only way to really tell them apart, well, there's 2 ways to tell them apart. One, depends where you are. If you're on the eastern side of the United States or Canada, you're looking at an eastern meadowlark. If you're on the western side, take a wild guess. You're looking at a western meadowlark. So that's one way to tell, just by your geographic location. They're a bird that likes open country areas, so they like fields, agricultural places, prairies, stuff like that. The other way to tell them apart is by their song. They're actually, they both are songbirds, and they have a slightly different song, and if you know how to tell it apart, you can tell the species apart. But they, for the most part, look very similar. So this is a question that has plagued biologists for a very long time. What really is a species? Are these 2 birds members of the same species, just on different sides of the continent? Are these turtles essentially the same species, just living in different river systems? Well, like I said, it's a very hard question to answer, and it really depends on how you view the world. The first thing I'm going to say, and something you want to remember, is that these are terms that we use to understand the world around us. So we decide what a species is, but these things are constantly evolving. And at what point does one species turn into another species? We don't know, because all we ever see is a snapshot in time. But it's an interesting question, and one we can talk about a little bit today. So as far as these 2 questions go, I don't know. Okay, so what does a species really mean? Well, the most widely applied concept, the one that people tend to think of, is the biological species concept. So in the biological species concept, the definition is very simple. You have a population where individuals within that population can interbreed, they can produce offspring, and those offspring not only are survive or are viable, but are also fertile and can produce offspring of their own. So the biological species concept would explain why all humans are considered the same species. We're not different species of humans, despite the fact that we live in different places and have all these local adaptations. A person from Norway can interbreed with a person from Indonesia. A person from Japan can interbreed with someone from Mexico and produce offspring. And those offspring can go on and be fertile, etc., right? So we're all the same species because of that same fact. And especially now that we can travel the whole world with airplanes, etc., the possibilities are endless, right? So these are examples of what we call the biological species concept. Now, there are situations where this can't necessarily apply. Can you think of any? Well, probably the most obvious one is that this whole thing is predicated on the fact that there is sexual selection happening. But there are species out there that are engaged in asexual reproduction. So something like this wouldn't be able to apply to them. So we'd need some other type of species concept as a result. So what are the barriers to reproduction if you end up with 2 species that can't interbreed? Well, we talk about reproductive isolation, and there could be a lot of different things that can qualify. We tend to divide them into 2 categories. the things that occur before the formation of the zygote, which, if you recall, is what happens when sperm and egg mix together, right? And they become a zygote, then becomes an embryo, fetus, all that. So we talk about zygotic barriers, and we have things that are pre-zygotic, happening before that fertilization occurs, and then we have post-zygotic barriers, things that happen after the zygote is formed. And these can really range in a lot of different ways. So here are these the primary examples here. In terms of pre-zygotic barriers, well, they can range from the fact that even though you could potentially interbreed, maybe you're using different habitats, undergoing habitat isolation, right? It shows here a couple of garter snakes, A and B. One seems to be in a more aquatic environment, one seems to be in a more terrestrial environment. Maybe they just don't ever meet up anyway in the wild because they use different habitats. Or it could be differences in timing of reproduction. So here they're showing a striped skunk and what looks like a hognose skunk. Both of these would have their own breeding schedules. You know, one might breed in early spring, one might breed in the middle of summer. And as a result, they're never, even if they were to interact, they wouldn't breed because different cycles, right? We don't tend to think of breeding cycles, but animals have very distinct breeding seasons, right? It could also be isolation based on behavior. So if you have a species, for example, that has a very elaborate courtship, well, you have to be a member of that species to know how to do that courtship, right? It could be a courtship display, could be, an elaborate dance or maybe an elaborate call. If you don't know how to do those things, then you're not going to get the opportunity to breed. So those are examples of things that interfere with the attempt to mate, right? You could also have prezygotic barriers that are more physiological in nature. It could be a mechanical isolation, and all that means is, how should I say this in a nice PC kind of way? Let's just say the hardware don't match sometimes, right? So you might have a situation where reproduction is going to be limited because the reproductive anatomy for the two individuals will not match up. They will not line up, right? Maybe not the right shape, maybe not the right size, maybe not the right spot. Who knows? And then finally, another type of isolation would be isolation of the gametes. So these would be the gametes being of different sizes, right? The sperm and the egg don't necessarily interact, or if they do, it could be the sperm is unable to actually fertilize through the egg. Right? When the sperm meets up with an egg, what happens is the sperm secretes things and produces things that are able to allow it to actually penetrate into the egg. It may not be able to do that, right? If there are different species. So there's prezygotic barriers that are regulating the behavior and the actual mating part of it, and then there's prezygotic barriers that interfere with the actual fertilization part. Okay, so those are the prezygotic barriers. I think they make a lot of sense. Now, what about a postzygotic barrier? So let's just say everything lines up and you get fertilization happening. So now you have a zygote with the complete set of chromosomes from both the maternal and the paternal side on a sexually reproducing species. Well, it could be that now you have this hybrid, but that hybrid is not going to be able to be born, right? It's inviable. There's something in the development during the stages of development of the egg, development of the zygote, that's being interfered with, right? Maybe not the right chemical signals are being produced. Maybe the thing produces something that is, deformed and unable to survive inside in utero. So we talk about this being reduced hybrid viability. It could be that you do produce an animal or plant, and it does become born or hatch or sprout or whatever we're going to use, right? So now you have a hybrid living in the ecosystem, but it's not able to reproduce itself. So the buck stops here, right? So the fertility is gone. So reduced hybrid fertility. Classic example of this is mixing a donkey with a horse, and you end up with a mule or a ginny, depending on which one's the male, which one's the female. Either of those, they're infertile. They can survive. You can have a mule. You can buy a mule, but it's not going to be able to produce a baby mules. There's no such thing as a baby mule. Well, I guess the mule when it's a baby, but you know what I mean. And then finally, you could also have a situation where the hybrid itself will break down. And you'll see this in plants sometimes where a hybrid will just not be able to sustain itself for any length of time. Right? So it's not a fertility thing, it's actually a survival thing, and the hybrid will start to break down. So these are all examples where it's the next generation that's being impacted. So post-zygotic barrier versus pre-zygotic barrier. Interesting stuff, you ask me. Okay, so we've talked about the biological species concept, but what are some other definitions of species? So I think of a very recent example. Colossal Biosciences, the biotech company, claimed that they de-extincted, quote unquote, a dire wolf. That's not what they did. What they did do is genetically modify an existing species, a gray wolf, and they made it look a little bit bigger and a little more like the dire wolf from the Game of Thrones movie, or a Game of Thrones show that belonged to Jon Snow. So that dire wolf, they called it a dire wolf based on a way to sort of backtrack. They said that they created a dire wolf based on the morphological species concept. And in this concept, what it's basically saying, and probably the easiest way to think of it is they're basically saying if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Morphological species concept is based on the idea that the characteristics of a creature are unique enough that we can say that it is this particular species. So in the case of a dire wolf, you modify a gray wolf enough and with the characteristics that kind of resemble a dire wolf, even though in reality dire wolves died out during the Ice Age, so we don't really know what they look like. A lot of people say they look like hyenas. But nonetheless, you modify an existing species enough, you can produce a whole new species based on this concept. So it looks and has some of the features and characteristics of that particular species. Now, it's a bit of a subjective measure, but then again, everything is. Subjective in the sense that you decide what traits matter, and that you decide how it the things that are necessary to make it what you claim it is. So that's the direwolf example, which they use the morphological species concept. Now, when direwolves were alive during the Ice Age, they had a particular role in their environment. They had a particular ecological niche. And the one of the rationales for bringing back these Pleistocene era or Pleistocene period animals like mammoths and direwolves is for them to basically recolonize their existing environment and do their existing job. They're to occupy their ecological niche. So this is another species concept, right? Every creature out there, every plant occupies a particular space in the ecosystem and plays a particular role in the ecosystem as food, as predator, as a regulator of a particular population of things, providing habitat for certain things. And the ecological species concept is basically arguing that if a species occupies a particular unique ecological niche, then it's probably a member of a species that does that, right? So if the direwolf does direwolf-like things, then maybe it is a direwolf, is basically what they're saying. So both of these species concepts are able to be applied to asexually reproducing critters, not just sexually reproducing species. Now, the other species concept that is important to know is the phylogenetic species concept. So phylogeny, and I have a whole video about this, you can watch it on Fokitis Lab YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell down below. In the phylogenetic species concept, what you're saying is everything has a unique evolutionary trajectory. And a species is basically defined as the end of the branches of a phylogenetic tree. So if you remember a phylogenetic tree, it's basically a visual representation of the evolutionary relationships between species that are alive today. And the way they get this information now is they will take the genomes and compare them across different species. So if the genome is similar enough, they're considered a particular species. But if they're different enough, they could be thought of as being different species. Now, again, there's a level of subjectivity here, right? How much of a genetic difference is necessary to be considered a different species? Humans and chimpanzees are pretty different. You can probably tell them apart if you need to, although I know some people where that might be difficult. But a chimpanzee is thought to have 98% of the human genome, right? And the little bit that's left is enough to make the difference between a human and a chimpanzee. In some cases, you have species that have even bigger genetic differences, but they're still considered the same species. So it really depends on what you set. And there's a lot of discussion about what percentage of difference is enough to be considered a different species. And where is it happening? Is it happening in places that have a lot of mutation? Or is it happening in places where mutation occurs very slowly? Right? What section of the DNA is the part you look at? So a lot of questions. But nevertheless, it's yet another way to consider species. And this is actually a big way people do things now, is they'll look at the genetics and try to line up and see how genetically divergent is this group of animals or this type of plant compared to the closely related species. Okay, so how do you get new species? Well, one way to get new species is to separate them and to force them to evolve separate from each other, not interbreed, and isolate them geographically. This is called allopatric speciation. So in allopatric speciation, there's some kind of barrier that separates populations. It could be an ocean, it could be a river, it could be a mountain, it could be a canyon, it could be a glacier, it could be an island versus the mainland, it could be anything. And there's countless examples where if you have a geographic barrier and you let enough time go by, the same species will diverge in two different pathways because they're adapting to their local environment. And they're going to change their phenotype accordingly. So if you look at the Isthmus of Panama, this was the land bridge that was formed between Central America and South America around the last ice age. And it basically separated the Atlantic from the Pacific Ocean. And when Panama was formed, species that at that time were inhabiting both oceans are now separate from each other and unable to interbreed. So you have this interesting situation where the waters down there, which are fairly similar, but you have the waters down there that are having species that now, being isolated from each other, are going on their own separate evolutionary paths. And a great example of this is actually the snapping shrimp of the genus Alphaeus. And here you have basically 30 or so shrimp, 15 on either side, that form pairs. So you had a species that got separated to two, and they started diverging. And when you look at the ones found in the Atlantic, there's like several species, 15 or so species in the Atlantic of these snapping shrimp. And then you look on the Pacific side of Panama, and you'll see slightly different versions of those same 15. So you end up with 15 pairs of snapping shrimp that can be paired up based on their more recent evolutionary separation. It's a great example of allopatric speciation, but there's no shortage of these. A little rarer, though, is sympatric speciation. So allopatric speciation is happening because there's a barrier, right, that separates it based on geography. In sympatric speciation, the species are living in the same place, right? They're in the same geographic area. But something has to happen that separates them. So what can happen? Well, it could be a genetic event, and we'll talk about this, polyploidy, right? So, creatures are diploid, gametes in sexually reproducing species are often haploid. And long story short, you can get different versions of these things based on how they split and how they recombine. So you can end up with a situation where you just all of a sudden have genetic incompatibility between two species that are, or between a species, individuals of a species living in the same area, but all of a sudden they're reproductively isolated. Another possibility is habitat differentiation. They're just using the habitat differently, and it decreases the chances of them encountering each other for mating. And then also sexual selection. You could have traits that are particularly that increase your chances of mating, but they can be different within your population. So what ends up happening is you start getting this assortment where certain individuals will attract certain individuals and then for mating, and then other individuals have different traits that attract a different subset. And over enough time, you'll start getting separation. Thing I will mention is that this is quite rare. The few cases that are out there are pretty cool. But in general, sympatric speciation happening in the same area is much less common than having some kind of barrier, or at least it's harder for us to detect. Let's put it that way. Okay, so how does the polyploidy thing work? Well, again, cell division, right? Meiosis is happening. During meiosis, what happens? Well, you separate your chromosomes, and then your gametes will receive half of the chromosomes, right? And then they'll refuse to get the complete set at the end after fertilization, right? But if you have an accident during cell division, you might end up with a situation where you have extra chromosomes. And when they recombine, well, normally it's a problem. Normally you end up with an inviable zygote. But there are cases where you could survive and you could produce this brand new hybrid that is incapable of breeding with the parents, because now they have extra set of chromosomes and they'll have to mate with other chromosomes or with other individuals that have the same number of chromosomes. So this is something that you see a lot in the plant world. Triploid plants, quadruploid plants. You get some things out there that have, instead of being 2N, there's 12N, right? I'm thinking about like oak trees, for example. It's very common in plants, much less so in animals. The one example you will always see is this one right here. The gray tree frog versus the Copes tree frog, which are found on the eastern side here of the United States. Gray tree frogs tend to be a little more common, but gray tree frogs, at the end of the day, they're just a Copes tree frog that has extra chromosomes. That's pretty much it. So at some point, a Copes tree frog type thing just had some kind of mitotic division that resulted in more chromosomes, right? So some sort of mitotic error, ended up having extra chromosomes, and then they refused during fertilization, and you ended up with a polyploid gamete, or a polyploid cell, which then developed and did not die off, remained viable, remained fertile. And now you have essentially a new species, because gray tree frogs cannot interbreed with Copes tree frogs. Other than that, they look pretty much indistinguishable. They're very hard to tell apart. There's little tiny characters, but it's very hard to tell apart. One way to tell them apart is by their sound, but looking at them, it's very hard to tell apart. You got to be basically an expert to do this. So polyploidy, it happens. What about habitat? Here's a cool example. So apple flies, apple maggot flies, their host plant for reproduction is the hawthorn, right? So there's an example of a hawthorn tree up there in the corner. And what happens is they basically land on the hawthorns and they lay their eggs, and then the eggs develop into larvae, which then consume the hawthorn fruit. And that's their native plant. But in places, including in Florida, apple trees were cultivated. I'm trying to remember if this was in Florida. I think it's in Florida. Or maybe Europe. I'm thinking Europe, maybe. Okay, I'm getting confused with another example. Sorry. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Non-native apple trees were planted, and they're close enough to hawthorn fruit that some of the flies started preferring apples, right? So they would lay their eggs into apples. The larvae would eat apples and survive. So what ends up happening is now you have, within your population, individuals preferring hawthorns and individuals preferring apples. Well, the difference here and the problem here, or not the problem, but the selection here, is that apple trees develop faster, and I think they also fruit earlier. So now the timing of reproduction over time is going to favor them being isolated further and further, because reproduction is based on these fruit that are now fruiting at different times. So you end up with a temporal isolation. And over time, you're starting to see differences. And right now, they're subspecies. That's what they consider them, subspecies or different versions. But enough time goes by, they could become two distinct species, a hawthorn fly and an apple fly. Kind of cool to think about. Okay, so what about sexual selection? So for this, we're going to use our case study, which is a pretty incredible sort of story, evolutionary story of cichlid fish in Africa's Rift Valley lakes, and specifically Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, places like that, like Tanganyika. So these fish are a great sort of real-world example of how sexual selection can drive the formation of new species, even when they are living in the same place. They're sympatric. There's no geographic isolation. So the story begins with some ancestral populations of cichlids living in these lakes. The two cichlids in particular that colonized these lakes early on, one came from the upper Nile River, right? So this is the famed Nile of Egypt, but sort of the upper reaches of it, and then also the Congo River, which is nearby. And these two species of cichlids, so we have two species of cichlids, colonized these lakes early on, right? And these fish both have variations in coloration, especially in the males, different shades of red, different shades of blue, and these are genetically inherited. And from these two, you'll end up with more than 700 species of cichlids, and all within a span of less than 20,000 years. So how does sexual selection enter the picture? Well, it's a process where individuals from one sex are going to be choosy about their mates, right? So what happens in this lake is you have some geographic isolation happening when the water levels go up and down. So water levels go down and you have allopatric speciation happening. Some fish will be cut off from other fish and they're going to form just like we talked about before with allopatric speciation, right? So this example, you have a lake full of orange fish and water level goes down and you get some of these geographically isolated fish now are going to start expressing that blue color, right? You could also have the sympatric, where you have the two species being separated, or not separated at all, but you have this blue coloration pop up, right? So these are the processes we're going to focus on. So in these lakes, they're very deep, and you'll have different groups of cichlids basically picking different areas of the lake, and under these different areas of the lake, you're going to have certain colors be more advantageous. Right? So you might have situations where, red color in the males is more preferable than, say, blue color, right? And it might be a sense of, what's more vibrant at different depths, right? So what will end up happening is female choice. Females will prefer over time to mate with the most vibrant ones, right? So some females will prefer to mate only with the red ones. Some females will prefer to mate only with the blue ones. And you end up with this situation where you have sexual selection over time producing essentially a reproductive barrier based on this behavior and this choosiness. And then over time, you're going to mix the the blue coloration and the red coloration and all the different variants in between, along with different areas of these big lakes with different depths and water levels going up and down. And then you're going to end up with a very, very, a lot of different species inhabiting the same place, right? So from this ancestral species, you now have more species, right? And then you get this explosive diversity now where you have hundreds of different cichlids and they each have different versions of these colors. Some are going to be blue, some are going to be, have more red, some will be orange, some will be all different things. They'll have different stripe patterns. And all of this is based on the fact that you have this very large ecosystem, different depths, right? Blue is very good for, some species or some individuals prefer blue, some species will prefer the red. Bottom line is the conditions are there where female choosiness is going to drive a lot of these differences. Okay, So that wraps up speciation. So the big question is, why does this stuff matter? Well, species concepts in generally matter, right? If you're going to preserve, for example, an endangered species, it pays to accurately define what that species is. But more recently, this idea of species concepts is becoming really, really interesting. So this is obviously a kind of bear, but what kind of bear is this thing? Well, this is an example of something called a pizzly. A pizzly is produced when a male grizzly mates with a female polar bear. On the flip side, you also have another species that's becoming important. It's becoming more and more common in the Arctic, called a growler bear. The bottom line is the pizzly and the growler bear both are hybrids between polar bears and grizzly bears, and specifically the barren grounds grizzly. Barren grounds grizzly are not the same as the brown bears that live on the coast in Alaska or the grizzlies that live in Yellowstone. They're actually kind of their own little subspecies that prefer tundra environments in northern Canada. So there, as climate change is happening and warming up the Arctic, you're getting a situation where barren ground grizzlies are now starting to expand into areas that previously just had polar bears. So you're increasing the contact between polar bears and grizzly bears, right? And whenever you have a new contact zone between species that can potentially interbreed, you'll often get hybrids forming. And these hybrids, this is nothing new. These are called contact zones, nothing new. Polar bears are actually evolutionarily derived from grizzlies. So it's not too long ago that populations of grizzlies were basically trapped on the ice and eventually evolved to become these predatory seal hunting white bears. So in a way, they're kind of just coming back to what they were before. Now, a lot of people are arguing that this is a bad thing because now you're having this, these species that aren't otherwise doing well becoming diluted over time, right? So it's just yet one more threat to, say, the polar bear. But on the other end, this could be considered an adaptation to climate change, right? This could be a way for polar bear genes, the majority of which will be preserved, to basically keep going on in spite of the increasing temperatures with climate change, right? So it depends on how you look at it. Time will tell if it's good or bad. I probably won't be here for the final answer. But nonetheless, it makes for an interesting case study in all of this. So with that,